go now? Okay. I'm Karissa. I'm the watercolor instructor here at Ben Franklin Crafts in Bonney Lake, Washington. And we're gonna do a painting today talking about some watercolor techniques. I mean, this is pretty, this part's not so, I'm just creating puddles of paint for watercolor. It says right in the name with watercolor, you're gonna use a lot more water than the actual pigment. So reactivate my dry watercolors, create a little puddle of water and transfer it from my color cell into my mixing cell. This is what I'm going to paint with, not the pure pigment. This gives me an opportunity to mix colors. I don't know if you're still filming. Okay. So we're going to create a water dam first, which is a type of masking, by first pre-wetting the paper. You can use just pure water if you want. My water is a little bit tinted with a little bit of pink, and I'm just painting down. Since I'm painting the sky, I'm going to paint the entire area down to the horizon, just using water. And I want my paper to be fully saturated with water before I come in and do a gradient wash. So I'm going to pick a couple of my colors. I've got cerulean blue here. I'm gonna paint with some cerulean, and probably as we get down to the horizon, I'm going to switch to yellow with maybe a little bit of my red. So I want there to be a nice strip of dark blue. This is the only amount of blue I'm gonna add. Clean out my brush and pull that color down using a slightly damp brush. That color is adequate to paint the entire sky area. So I'm picking a direction. I like going horizontal. I don't want to go horizontal and then vertical. I'll end up with a checkerboard pattern in my sky. So pick a direction and stick with that when you're doing a wash. I'm gonna switch over to my Azo yellow before I take the blue all the way down. And I'm going to add the yellow. And it might be fun to maybe make this look like maybe a sunrise or a sunset. So I'm gonna add my yellow kind of where I would think the sun would be coming up. And just because it will be fun, I'm gonna add a little bit of red to the outside edge again at the horizon. So I just added some red to the horizon, and I'm gonna add just the tiniest bit of red above the yellow. I added the red above the yellow because blue, not a green sky. So I'm going to blend these colors together. Just going back and forth, again, horizontal. And it might be fun to add just a little bit more of a pop of yellow just along the horizon line. And that is our gradated wash. Okay, so my watercolor paper is slightly damp still here at the horizon, but it's pretty dry up at the top where we put the strip of blue. You can test that by touching the back, using the back of your finger, the back of your hand on the paper, especially if it's a cotton-based watercolor paper, to check to see if there's still damp or moisture in your paper. The paper will feel cold to the touch. So there is a little bit of water. We're gonna try to do a wet on wet technique. So my paper is wet from the paint that I just put down in the sky down here at the horizon, and I'm going in with wet paint. And we are going to try to do maybe some distant trees or something at the horizon line. So I'm gonna mix up kind of a neutral violet color. And we're gonna see if this works. All right, so this, the paper is not quite as wet as we need it to be wet on wet. That's not a big deal. All we have to do is come in with a little bit of water, pre-wet the area that we want our trees to kind of blend and bleed. I'm gonna do that across the entire horizon on either side, because that's kind of where I want my trees to be. And come in with that darker violet, gray violet. And when I'm doing wet on wet, all I need to do, because the paper is already wet, I just have to touch or dot my color down. And because the water is already saturated with water, the color is going to be dragged up into the areas that are wet still and create some really beautiful variation, reaching limbs, and it's going to be a very soft edge. So I'm just dotting in this color. Kind of just pushing it. We are going to paint now the wildflower meadow using a variety of different techniques, but the first one I'm going to do is called scumbling. I have this really hard edge between the sky and the background foliage in the trees, and it's a stark contrast to where I want my wildflower meadow. Because watercolor is transparent, this line will have a tendency to show up in my finished image. And so I can either paint my entire landscape painting using wet on wet technique, so everything kind of blends together and so there's a smooth transition. Or if I end up in a situation where I I have this really hard edge and it's dry like it is now. There's a slight dampness to this. I can come in and scumble. Scumbling is where you use a brush and rub, which reactivates some of the watercolor and can create a softening effect to that hard edge. I won't be able to lift out or blend this hard edge all the way out, but it will help create a softer transition so that it's not looking like I took a piece of colored paper, cut it out, and stuck it here at the bottom. These two areas will blend a little bit easier, a little bit better, and feel like they are meant to be in the same painting. Okay, I don't know if you want to.
All right, back on.
Okay, so I've scumbled this line. It softened a couple of areas, which is what I was hoping for. And my paper is a little bit damp. I do need to be careful about adding paint over the areas that I've scumbled over, because it does rough up the fibers in those areas that I've kind of scrubbed using my brush. Those can cause a funny textured area if I'm not careful about applying the paint to this wet area. To avoid it completely, I can allow my paper to dry and then come back and paint over the top. But we're gonna just go right in. I don't know if you want to. I've mixed up a very watered down blue-green, and that's gonna be the base of my meadow. So I'm just coming in. This area at the horizon line is still a little bit wet. But as I go down, this paper has no water in it. So we're going to end up doing a wet on dry technique to quickly fill in an area. Just by laying down some of this green, cool green in this meadow area. If I want it to look like there are, maybe some swaths of wildflower meadows, flowers in the meadow, then I can come in with a little bit of color. I'm going to use some red. Maybe there's some poppies. And while the green is still a little bit wet, I can come in and create these large shapes that right now don't look like much. But later on, when we put some individual flowers towards the bottom of our paper, our brain will fill in the blank and we'll read these large red patches as blocks of flowers. Yeah. Let's do this darker, richer. If I want some fun textures, I can use a variety of different other tools or mediums. I'm going to show one of my favorites. If I want to have some light colored blades of grass, and I only want to use watercolor, not ink or acrylic to paint on top of my watercolors, what I can do is use something like a palette knife or an angled back of like a brush or a piece of, you know, old credit card. And when my paper is just still damp, just barely, I can come in with the edge and scratch the surface of my painting. And that kind of squeegees the paint out of the way and holds that light shape. If my painting is still too wet, instead of a light shape, I'll end up with a dark shape as the paint comes back in to fill the area that I've damaged a little bit of the top fibers, and that will create a dark mark. Both can be really pretty, but right now I'm aiming for some light shapes. Less is more. Don't need to go overboard. Your brain's gonna fill in a lot of the information that you're leaving out. I want to start adding some flowers in our meadow now. So what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to try to create some distant flowers. I could come in and create individual little dots, but they're all going to be about the same size and shape. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a technique called splatter. So I'm going to use just an extra scrap piece of paper, lay it over my sky where I don't want any splatters to happen. And I like using my finger with some fairly thick, less water, more pigment paint on my brush bristles. And I am going to create these very, very fine splatters. I'm barely flicking any paint off my finger onto my painting. And I'm concentrating these very, very fine splatters towards the top of the horizon, because as I get closer down to the bottom of my painting, that's also closer to the viewer if this was a photograph or a real place. So I can do my detail work, do a couple of individual, more detailed flowers down here at the bottom. I'm also doing my best to try to add these splatters over those patches of red that we painted wet on wet when we did our dry wash, our dry technique of filling in the green of the meadow. Okay, so we're gonna put some individual, more detailed flowers here in front. So I'm just gonna grab that same red that I was doing to create that fine mist of small flowers in the meadow. I have it fairly thick. I'd say medium type consistency. I don't want too much water, and my paper is dry, so this is another instance of wet on dry. Wet on dry is really good for detail work if you want something to show up then having your paper to be dry, you have complete control over where you have your colors go, because there's no water in the paper. The paint that I'm putting down isn't going to blend like it did up here. This is a very, very soft edge up here, so it can create the illusion of distance or blending by itself. With these individual, more detailed flowers that I'm painting here, where I'm doing my brush stroke is where the paint is going to be, and it's not going to move unless I come back and move the paint with my brush. So I'm just doing kind of some random dots, some small ones, some ones that are grouped together, trying to vary the distance between them. So some are closer together than others. So I've got some flowers here, and I've got a darker blue-green here. So it's a fairly thick consistency paint that I can now come in and do individual stems. Maybe I'll come back and add some foliage. If I switch to a liner brush, then I can get some very fine lines here. And I kind of think that we need to have some darker foliage, so I'm going to switch back to a larger round brush. Same darker blue. And just add a couple of suggestions of maybe some grass. Maybe some leaves. And if I'm going to mix up a color or a certain consistency of paint, so I've got this dark down here for the foliage and the grass around our more detailed flowers, I'm gonna find an excuse to add that same color at least in one other area. And if those areas are a little too prominent, they're popping forward too much, then I can just take a slightly damp brush and kind of just soften that bottom edge of those grass tufts that are, instead of the light on dark, they're dark against a light background. Just by softening the bottom edge, they kind of start to blend into the background rather than stand out. And so they don't feel as disjointed. I feel like they belong in this painting. Okay, the last thing that I like to do, it's my favorite part, is to peel off the tape. So you've got this beautiful white clean border all the way around your painting.